It started with a silence that felt almost deliberate, as though the entire house was holding its breath. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. I remember standing in the kitchen that night, the faint hum of the refrigerator being the only thing that reminded me I wasn't trapped in some void. Outside, the wind was crawling along the windows, brushing against the glass like fingers seeking a way in. It was a late November evening, and every inch of the house seemed to shiver under the weight of the cold. I had been staring at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds pass, wondering why my son hadn't come down for dinner. Ethan had been distant for months now, silent dinners, evasive eyes, a perpetual air of exhaustion. I'd told myself it was teenage angst, that there was nothing more to it than the heavy fog of adolescence. But lately, even that reassurance had begun to rot. There was a heaviness in him, something that didn't belong to childhood or growing pains, something darker. That night, the silence stretched too far, too long, until it felt like the walls themselves were warning me to move. I told myself to let him be, that barging into his room would only push him further away. But beneath that reasoned voice there was another, ancient and primal, a whisper from the part of me that used to wake in the middle of the night before he cried, that could sense his pain before he spoke. That instinct was louder than thought. It told me something was wrong, not wrong in the ordinary sense, not a bad grade or a fight with friends, but wrong in a way that felt cold and irreversible. I stood up before I even realized what I was doing, my chair scraping softly against the tiled floor, and I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand grazing the wall for balance. Every creak of the steps sounded louder than it should have. When I reached the top, the hallway was cloaked in a dim light, half lit by the small lamp near the guest room, and everything seemed still, too still. His door was closed as usual. There was a faint line of light slipping out from underneath it, flickering as though from a screen or candle. For a moment I just stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I remember how my heart began to beat faster, how something in me wanted to turn around, to go back downstairs, to pretend everything was fine. Because there's a part of you, as a parent, that fears the truth more than anything else. We convince ourselves that not knowing is safer. But then I thought of the way he'd looked that morning, pale, hollow-eyed, wearing the same hoodie he'd worn for days. I thought about the way he avoided my touch when I placed my hand on his shoulder, how he flinched as though my affection might burn him. That image cut through every excuse I had. My hand closed around the doorknob, cold against my palm, and I turned it slowly. The door opened with a quiet click, and the air that spilled out hit me like a gust of something foul. It wasn't a smell I could name. It was sharp, metallic, almost electric, but it carried something that made my skin crawl. His room was dark except for the faint, trembling light of a desk lamp in the corner. For a second, my eyes struggled to adjust. I expected the usual clutter, clothes on the floor, books scattered across the desk, but what I saw froze me in place. Every inch of the walls was covered, not with posters or photographs, but with papers, drawings, and photographs glued or pinned together like some kind of chaotic collage. Strings of red yarn crisscrossed from corner to corner, connecting faces, words, symbols. My breath caught as I took it in, the chaotic scrawl of ink covering the wallpaper, the repeated words "they're watching, she knows." The eyes never close. My own reflection stared back at me from a dozen fragments of broken mirror glass taped across the walls, each piece distorting me into something unrecognizable. And right there, at the center of it all, was a photograph of our family, Ethan, his father, and me. But my face was violently scratched out with thick, jagged lines of black marker, almost carved into the photo itself. I took a slow, involuntary step forward, my pulse hammering so hard that it drowned out everything else. The floorboards moaned softly under my weight. My voice came out a whisper, barely human. "Ethan?" No answer, only the quiet buzz of the lamp. I called his name again, louder this time, but the sound felt small against the oppressive silence. My eyes darted across the walls, the chaotic symphony of madness and pain. There were pages torn from notebooks, words written backward, numbers, arrows. Some of the ink looked fresh, still glistening. On his desk, there was an open notebook, and I couldn't stop myself from looking. The handwriting was his, but it was jagged, desperate, uneven, like the thoughts had clawed their way out of him. Phrases leapt out at me. The voice said, "She's not real. It's inside the walls. Can't sleep. Can't stop it. Can't stop her." My stomach twisted. It was only then that I noticed something else. The smell of smoke, faint but unmistakable, curling out from beneath a pile of paper on the floor near the bed. I rushed forward, heart thundering, and saw that one corner of the carpet was blackened, as though something had been burned there recently. My hands trembled as I reached out, pulling back a small piece of paper that had half melted into ash. It was a sketch, my face again, this time drawn with eyes completely blacked out. My breath hitched. I looked around, my thoughts spinning, trying to understand. None of this made sense. The boy who used to sit at the piano, who loved science projects, who used to make me laugh with his shy, crooked grin, he couldn't have created this. Not this world of paranoia and darkness. Something must have happened. Something terrible. Then came a sound, so faint I almost missed it. A soft click. I turned toward the closet where the sound had come from. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of blackness cutting through the dim light. My throat went dry. "Ethan?" I whispered again. Still nothing. The silence that followed was unbearable. I took a step closer to the closet, each breath heavy, shallow, trembling. When I reached out to touch the handle, the wood felt cold, too cold, and I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at that thin gap of darkness. And then, just when I began to pull the door open, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The vibration startled me so violently that I gasped aloud. I fumbled it out, my fingers clumsy, and saw a notification flash across the screen. A message. From Ethan. It said only, "Don't go in there." My blood turned to ice. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. I stumbled back, eyes wide, staring at the closet as if it might open on its own. My mind couldn't process what was happening. Where was he? Was he watching me? Was this some kind of sick joke? My voice cracked as I shouted his name into the room, but the only reply was the echo of my own fear. My body moved before my brain did. I grabbed the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and I pressed 911. The line clicked, and a calm voice began to speak, but I couldn't form the words properly. My tongue felt heavy, my throat raw. "There's something wrong with my son," I managed to whisper, the words spilling out in fragments. "Please, I think he's in danger. I'm in danger. There's something—" I looked around the room again, unable to finish. The operator asked me for my address, her voice steady and professional, and I gave it to her, my voice cracking on the final syllables. She told me to stay where I was, that help was on the way, but staying there felt impossible. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, to get out of that suffocating room. And yet, I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, because as terrified as I was, I couldn't abandon him. He was my son. Whatever darkness had swallowed him, I had to face it. I stood there, phone clutched in my hand, trying to breathe through the panic, when suddenly the light flickered. Once. Twice. Then went out completely. The room fell into absolute darkness. I froze. The faint hum of electricity died away, replaced by something else. A soft, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. Close. Too close. My heart stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again from somewhere near the closet. Shallow. Uneven. Someone, or something, was inside. For a moment, I thought I would faint. My fingers tightened around the phone, but the screen had gone black. No light, no sound, just the darkness pressing against me. And then I remembered the operator's voice still faintly echoing through the line. "Ma'am, stay calm. Officers are on their way." I wanted to answer, but I was afraid to make a sound, afraid to breathe, because the breathing inside the closet had stopped. Whoever, or whatever, was there now knew I was listening. The silence that followed was worse than any sound could have been. It stretched and stretched until I thought I'd lose my mind. And then suddenly the closet door creaked open just an inch wider. I didn't move. I couldn't. The smell of something metallic, blood, drifted into the air. In that moment, everything inside me shattered. I realized that whatever had taken hold of my son was beyond my understanding, beyond what love or reason could fix. I realized that calling for help had been the only thing left to do. My voice was gone, my body frozen, my mind screaming silently. And then, through the dark, a single beam of light cut through, the flashing red and blue outside the window, reflecting faintly through the cracks in the blinds. The sirens had arrived. Relief and terror collided inside me as I stumbled backward, eyes still fixed on the closet door. Before we continue, tell me, if it were you standing in that darkness, what would you have done? Would you open the door or run? I want to hear what your instinct whispers. Because when I think back to that night, I still feel the moment the world tilted and everything I thought I knew about my son dissolved into that chilling stillness. And when the sirens finally stopped outside, and heavy footsteps began to climb the stairs, I wasn't sure whether they were coming to save us, or to find out what had already been lost. When the officers arrived, the house no longer felt like my home. It was just a structure filled with echoes, every corner heavy with the residue of something I couldn't yet name. Their flashlights cut through the darkness like blades, slicing over the walls of Ethan's room, over the frantic drawings, the fragments of faces, the looping, desperate words. I stood near the doorway, hugging myself, trying to keep from shaking, but the tremors came anyway. One of the officers asked if I'd touched anything, and I shook my head. My voice had vanished. My throat felt raw from the inside, as if the fear itself had burned it. The air was thick with that strange metallic smell, and when one of them opened the closet, shining his beam inside, I could barely look. I braced myself for the worst, for the unbearable possibility that I might see him there. But the closet was empty. Just clothes, some notebooks stacked neatly on the floor, a few burnt papers, and something else. A small camera lens embedded high in the corner, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right. The officer reached up and gently pulled it out, turning it over in his hands. "It's off," he said, voice low. "No battery." But I saw the way he glanced toward the walls, how his jaw tightened. Even he felt the wrongness seeping from the room. I kept asking the same question, over and over. "Where is he? Where's my son?" They tried to calm me, to reassure me that they were doing everything they could. They checked the windows, still locked. The back door, untouched. One of them went outside to scan the property, while another began taking photos of the room. The shutter sound was sharp and intrusive, each click like a small wound against the silence. I watched the flashes bounce off the mirror shards, each reflection showing me a broken version of myself. I wanted to believe this was some kind of nightmare, that I would wake up to find Ethan asleep in his bed, safe, ordinary, but there was no waking from this. There was only the slow, cold realization that I had missed something enormous, that the signs had been there all along and I had been too afraid to see them. The night blurred into fragments, questions, instructions, paperwork. They asked about his behavior, his friends, his routines. Every answer I gave sounded smaller, weaker, less certain than the last. Yes, he'd been quieter lately. No, he didn't go out much. Yes, sometimes he talked to himself, but I thought it was just gaming or music. I could hear myself speaking, but I didn't recognize the voice. At one point, an officer gently guided me downstairs, away from the room, saying they needed to take more evidence. I sat on the couch, my hands trembling in my lap. The lights downstairs felt too bright, too artificial. On the coffee table was a mug I had made for him when he was 10, painted with childish swirls of color and the words, "Best son ever." I reached for it without thinking, my fingers tracing the faded paint. That's when something inside me broke, quietly, like glass cracking under slow pressure. I think it was around then that I noticed the small red light blinking faintly from the corner of the living room shelf. It was so subtle, so easy to miss, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I stood up, my breath catching, and realized it was another camera, just like the one from his closet, hidden, aimed directly at where I usually sat on the couch. My heart pounded as I pointed it out to the officer, who carefully removed it, his face darkening. He asked if I'd installed it, and I shook my head furiously. He muttered something into his radio, but I couldn't make out the words. That was the moment I truly understood that whatever Ethan had been caught in wasn't just inside his mind. It was all around us. Something or someone had twisted the fabric of his reality until he couldn't tell what was real anymore. Hours passed. The flashing lights outside turned the windows into a strobe of red and blue reflections. Neighbors gathered behind their curtains, whispering. I felt like a ghost in my own skin. When they finally left, promising to return in the morning with a search team and mental health officers, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. I wandered through the rooms, every creak of the floorboards amplifying the void. I should have gone to bed, but I couldn't. Sleep was an impossible concept now. I sat by his bedroom door for a long time, staring at it as though expecting it to breathe. At some point, I began to notice small details I hadn't before. The faint scratches near the baseboards, the way the lamp cord had been sliced and reconnected with tape, the faint hum of something electronic inside the wall. My pulse quickened. I leaned closer and pressed my ear against the plaster. For a moment, there was only silence. Then faintly, beneath the surface, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, too steady to be random, too deliberate to ignore. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe it was desperation, or guilt, or love, probably all of them. I went downstairs, found a small hammer from the toolbox, and came back up. The house felt wrong now, warped. Every sound seemed amplified. The ticking clock, the whisper of wind through the vents. I stood before the wall and tapped once, softly, and the sound came back. 1, 2, 1, 2. A pattern. My hands were trembling as I began to chip away at the plaster. Small flakes fell to the floor like snow. The sound grew louder. When I broke through the first thin layer, the hammer hit something metallic. I stopped, heart pounding. I peeled away more of the wall with my fingers until I saw it. An embedded device like a microphone or sensor, connected to a thin wire that disappeared deeper inside. My mind spun. I pulled the device out and stared at it in disbelief. Someone had placed it there, hidden within the walls of my son's room. The realization hit me so hard that I had to sit down. This wasn't a delusion. Ethan hadn't imagined it all. He really was being watched. Or at least, he had reason to believe he was. The thought twisted through me like a knife. I remembered all those nights I'd heard him pacing, muttering under his breath, the way he'd cover the vents with towels, unplug his computer, whisper about voices. He wasn't losing his mind. He was trying to protect himself. My chest tightened as tears burned my eyes. I whispered his name into the emptiness, a small, helpless sound that vanished before it reached the air. Hours slipped away. Dawn came slow and colorless, painting the windows with a pale, unforgiving light. I sat on the edge of his bed, surrounded by the wreckage of his world. The scattered papers, the burnt sketches, the endless repetitions of fear and confusion written in his hand. And yet, as the morning light crawled across the wall, something new caught my attention. A small envelope, taped behind one of the drawings, barely visible. I reached out with trembling fingers and pulled it free. My name was written on the front, in his handwriting. For a long moment, I couldn't open it. My hands refused to move. When I finally tore the envelope, a single sheet of paper slid out. His words were messy, rushed, but unmistakably his. Mom, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I tried to fix it. I tried to stop them, but it's everywhere now. Don't look for me. It's safer if you don't. You'll understand soon. I love you. The room spun. My vision blurred. I felt my whole body shake as I pressed the letter to my chest, choking back a sound that wasn't quite a sob. Love and terror collided inside me, leaving only the hollow ache of loss. But even through the grief, something in the letter didn't sit right. The phrasing, "You'll understand soon." It wasn't a goodbye. It was a warning. The police returned that morning, bringing technicians who dismantled parts of the wall, finding 2 more devices hidden within the structure, one near the vent, another beneath the floorboards. They traced the wires, followed them through the walls, and found they all converged near the basement. The basement, which had always been locked. My husband had sealed it years ago, claiming it was unsafe after a pipe burst. And somehow I had just accepted that. I followed the officers down, the air growing colder with every step. The basement door creaked open after years of disuse, revealing the smell of damp wood and metal. Their flashlights swept across the room and stopped. There, in the far corner, was a small desk covered in equipment, monitors, hard drives, cables, dozens of small devices identical to the ones found in Ethan's room, a surveillance hub, wired into the walls of our home. My knees buckled. I gripped the railing to keep from collapsing. One of the officers turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "Did your husband work with electronics?" he asked quietly. I nodded slowly, the world tilting around me. He had. It had been his hobby before he passed. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then knelt by the desk, studying the cables. "These are old," he said. "Some haven't been powered in years, but someone reconnected them recently." My heart stopped. Ethan. He must have discovered them. He must have realized that the voices he heard, the eyes he felt on him, were coming from inside his own home. The terror, the paranoia. It wasn't madness. It was the truth, twisted by fear and loneliness. My son had tried to uncover something he couldn't understand, and it had consumed him. I leaned against the wall, sobbing quietly, the cold cement biting against my palms. The officers spoke in hushed tones, but their words barely reached me. All I could think of was his letter, the last trace of his voice, his promise that I would understand soon. And as the morning light began to filter through the narrow basement window, I realized that understanding was beginning to dawn, not as a comfort, but as a burden. My son had uncovered a secret buried in the bones of our house, one that had driven him to the edge. But if there was one thing I knew then with unshakable certainty, it was that I wasn't done searching. I would find him. I would bring him home, whatever it took. Because love, when stripped of everything else, fear, guilt, logic, becomes something raw and indestructible. And that love was the only thing I had left. The house looked different in daylight, but not kinder. Morning light poured through the windows like something foreign, pale and sterile, revealing dust where there should have been comfort, cracks where there should have been warmth. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of me, the same cup I'd poured hours ago while the officers dismantled cables in the basement. The smell of burned metal still clung to the air. I could hear their last words echoing. "We'll keep searching, ma'am." And then the slam of the door as they left me alone again with a house that no longer felt like mine. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was its own presence, thick and waiting. I pressed my palms against the table, feeling the pulse of my heart through the wood, and thought of Ethan's letter. "You'll understand soon." The words had lived in me all night, crawling through my mind like a code I hadn't yet cracked. Upstairs, his room waited. The same walls covered in evidence of fear and obsession, the same red strings and torn pages that had haunted my dreams for months now. But as I climbed the stairs again, I realized something had changed inside me. The fear was still there, yes, but it had become something else. Purpose, maybe. I wasn't just a mother terrified anymore. I was a mother searching, fighting, refusing to accept that my child had vanished into madness. I opened his door slowly, the hinges crying softly, and stepped inside. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow stripes, cutting through the chaos. The words on the walls seemed almost to shift under the light, and as I looked closer, I noticed patterns I hadn't before. Lines of numbers scrawled in the margins of the drawings, coordinates maybe, or times. And there, near his desk, a series of arrows leading downward toward the floorboards. I knelt and followed them, my fingers brushing the wooden planks until I found one slightly loose. I hesitated. Some part of me feared what I might find, but then I pried it up. Beneath it, wrapped in a thin layer of cloth, was a small flash drive. My hands trembled as I picked it up, brushing off the dust. I didn't even own a laptop anymore, but Ethan's old computer sat in the corner of the room, half buried under papers. When I pressed the power button, it hesitated, then whirred to life, the blue light flickering weakly. The screen took forever to load, the sound of the fan filling the silence. When it finally came to life, I plugged in the flash drive and waited. A single folder appeared, labeled simply, Watch. I clicked it. The video opened to a dimly lit image. Ethan, sitting in this very room, his face pale, his eyes hollow but burning with determination. He was whispering into the camera, his voice shaky but focused. If you're seeing this, Mom, then I didn't stop it in time, but you have to listen. Dad wasn't just building surveillance equipment. He was experimenting with resonance, sound frequencies that could affect the brain. He said he wanted to prove that emotion could be mapped through vibration, but something went wrong. The system kept running even after he stopped. It's in the walls now. It's alive in the signals. Every time I tried to destroy it, it rebuilt itself. The only way to end it is from the source, the basement relay. His eyes darted toward the camera and his voice dropped. But if you go down there, don't listen to it. Don't hear it. That's how it gets in. The screen went black. For a long time I sat frozen, the hum of the computer filling the space where his voice had been. My breath came unevenly, shallow, as if my body couldn't decide whether to cry or run. The truth, or some twisted version of it, was finally taking shape. The strange sounds, the paranoia, the cameras, the whispers in the vents. It wasn't madness, not entirely. My husband's experiments had left behind something that had learned to live on in our home. Maybe it was only faulty circuitry. Maybe it was something beyond science. But whatever it was, it had trapped Ethan in its web until he became part of it. I stood, the chair scraping harshly against the floor, and looked toward the hallway that led down to the basement. My every instinct screamed against it, but there was also that other voice, the one that had kept me moving since this began, the one that whispered that love is louder than fear. At the top of the stairs, I paused. The air seemed thicker here, the faint hum vibrating faintly through the banister. Each step creaked under my weight, carrying me deeper into the cold. I reached the basement door, the same one the police had left ajar, and pushed it open. The light switch didn't work, so I used my phone's flashlight again. The beam swept across the room, landing on the desk of equipment they'd found earlier. The monitors were dark now, but as I stepped closer, a faint flicker rippled across one of the screens. Static, then an image. I leaned in. It was Ethan, live, or something that looked like him. His image glitched, face fragmenting into pixels, then reforming. He was standing somewhere dark, the faint glow of old monitors behind him. "Mom," he said, and my breath caught. "You found it." The words came distorted, the voice layered, as though two people were speaking at once. I swallowed hard, tears stinging my eyes. "Where are you?" I whispered. "Come home, please." He tilted his head slightly, the motion jerky, unnatural. "It doesn't want me to leave, but you can still stop it." The static thickened, swallowing part of his face, and I could hear something else now beneath his voice. A low tone, almost like a heartbeat made of sound. It pulsed through the air, through the floor, into my chest. My vision swam. "Mom," he said again, louder this time, the distortion cracking around the edges. "Don't listen. Whatever happens, don't listen." The screen went black again. The tone didn't stop. It grew louder, vibrating through the wires, through the walls. I staggered backward, clutching my head, trying to block it out. But the sound was inside me now, reverberating behind my eyes. My phone flickered in my hand, the flashlight stuttering with each pulse. The air itself seemed to ripple. Somewhere within that sound, I could swear I heard words, fragments of voices, layered over one another, familiar and foreign all at once. My husband's laughter, Ethan's whisper, my own name. I stumbled toward the circuit panel where all the wires converged. My vision blurred, but I could see the main relay Ethan had mentioned, an old rusted console humming faintly, lights blinking like dying fireflies. I grabbed the nearest piece of metal, a wrench left by the officers, and raised it above my head. The hum rose in pitch, sharp enough to make me cry out. For a split second, I thought I heard Ethan's voice again, pleading, "Mom, wait." But whether it was real or another echo, I didn't know. I brought the wrench down hard. The impact exploded into light and sound, a burst that threw me backward onto the cold concrete. Sparks rained down, smoke filled the air, and the hum finally, blessedly, died. The silence that followed was absolute. I lay there, gasping, tears spilling down my face, unsure whether I had destroyed the machine or everything. Then, through the haze, I heard it. A soft knock on the basement door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. For a long moment after the knock, I couldn't tell if the sound had really happened or if it was still echoing inside my head from the static that had filled the basement. The smoke curled in slow ribbons around me, and the smell of burnt circuitry stung my eyes. My heartbeat was the only rhythm left, a frantic metronome counting out the seconds between fear and action. 3 knocks. Deliberate, human, patient. I forced myself upright, every muscle trembling, the wrench still clutched in my hand like a relic of some half-remembered war. The concrete floor was cold against my bare feet as I stepped toward the stairs. Each creak of wood sounded like a warning. At the top of the stairs, the door stood half-closed, light spilling through the narrow gap in a thin, trembling line. My voice broke the silence before I could stop it. "Ethan?" Nothing. Only the slow exhale of air through the vents. I climbed 1 step, then another. Halfway up, the floor above me groaned again. Soft footsteps, careful, as though someone were testing each board before committing their weight. Hope and dread collided in my chest. When I reached the last step, I pushed the door open with the wrench still raised. The kitchen stood before me bathed in the weak light of early afternoon, the dust hanging like mist. And there, standing in the doorway that led to the hall, was my son. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that single sight. He looked thinner, older somehow, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, but clearer than I'd seen them in months. He was alive. I wanted to run to him, to pull him into my arms, but something in his stillness held me back. He watched me silently, as though measuring whether I was real. Then his lips moved, and the smallest, roughest whisper escaped. "You stopped it." I nodded, tears blurring my vision. "It's over," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I wasn't sure I believed them. The house still felt heavy, the air dense with the memory of that hum. He took a slow step toward me, the floor creaking beneath his weight. "I could feel it fade," he murmured, like someone finally turned off the noise. His voice broke on the last word, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw my child again. Not the haunted version I'd met through the drawings and recordings, but the boy who used to laugh at thunderstorms. I reached for him, and this time he didn't flinch. He let me hold him. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. The silence around us changed. It wasn't oppressive anymore. It was exhausted. The house seemed to sigh with us. Eventually, we pulled apart. He looked toward the basement door, eyes dark but steady. "It wasn't Dad's fault," he said quietly. "He was trying to build something to listen, to emotions, to pain, but it started listening back." His words trembled, and I understood that even he didn't fully grasp what had happened. It didn't matter. Whatever had lived in those circuits was gone now, or at least sleeping. The afternoon stretched on gently. I opened the windows for the first time in months. Cold November air rolled through the rooms, carrying away the burnt smell, the static. Dust floated like small pieces of forgiveness. Ethan helped me gather the papers from his walls, folding them carefully into boxes. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Every movement was a conversation, every shared glance a promise that we were still here. When the last drawing came down, the walls looked naked, raw, but clean. I traced my fingers over the faint marks left by the tape and whispered, "You're free now." That night we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars bloom one by one. The world outside seemed impossibly quiet. He told me bits and pieces, how he'd discovered the cameras, how the frequencies had made him hear voices that weren't real, but felt real, how he'd fled the house for a few days, hiding in a friend's shed until he thought he could come back. "I wanted to fix it," he said. "I thought if I could find where the sound started, maybe I could make it stop before it hurt you too." I listened, my chest tight with pride and sorrow. "You did," I said. "You saved us both." He looked at me, eyes glistening in the faint porch light. "Do you think we'll ever be normal again?" I smiled through the ache. "Normal's overrated," I said softly. "But we'll be okay." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and cold sky. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, then faded, swallowed by the night. For the first time in so long, I didn't flinch at the sound. It was just life continuing, indifferent and beautiful. Ethan leaned his head on my shoulder, and I closed my eyes. If you're listening to this story, wherever you are, remember this. Darkness can live inside the walls of any home, sometimes built by love, sometimes by mistake. But it's love, too, that can pull the nails out, piece by piece, until light gets in again. Morning came slowly, like a cautious apology from the sky. The light that entered the house this time was different, warmer, patient, no longer harsh or sterile. It brushed across the bare walls of Ethan's room, the ones we had scrubbed clean the night before, and the air carried only the scent of soap and the faint sweetness of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. I stood at his doorway watching him sleep, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt like forgiveness. For months I had feared I would never see this again, that the boy I loved had dissolved into the noise. Now he was here, fragile but real, a living heartbeat in the stillness. Downstairs, I opened the windows wide. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards, and the chill November wind rolled through the rooms, sweeping away the last traces of static and smoke. Dust lifted from the corners like pale birds taking flight. The old refrigerator hummed softly, ordinary and comforting. For the first time in what felt like years, the silence of the house was not a threat. It was rest. When Ethan came down, his hair mussed, eyes half awake, he smiled. A small, tired smile that carried the weight of everything we had survived. I set a mug of cocoa in front of him and another for myself, and we sat together at the kitchen table without speaking. The quiet between us was no longer distance. It was understanding. In the days that followed, we worked side by side. We cleared the basement first, cutting away the twisted cords, packing the remaining equipment into boxes to be taken away. Each coil of wire we pulled up felt like unthreading an old grief. When the last of the consoles was gone, we painted the walls white, covering the stains and the shadows alike. Ethan's laughter, soft, hesitant, returned as the room filled with light. Upstairs, we turned his old bedroom into something new. Fresh sheets, plants on the windowsill, a sketchbook waiting on his desk. He told me he wanted to start drawing again, but this time things that are alive. I told him that sounded perfect. At night, we would sit on the porch and watch the stars. Sometimes he talked about his father, about the man who had once chased sound the way others chased faith. There was no anger in his voice anymore, only a kind of wistful acceptance. Maybe he was trying to understand us, Ethan said one evening. Maybe that was his way of listening. I nodded. Then we'll learn to listen the right way, I said, and he smiled. The wind stirred the leaves, whispering through the quiet like a benediction. Weeks passed, and winter arrived with its slow grace. The world outside turned silver, and the house that had once been a cage became a shelter again. Friends who had drifted away began to visit. Laughter began to echo through the halls that had known only static. Ethan started volunteering at a local art center, helping younger kids paint murals. I watched him from the doorway one afternoon, a brush in his hand, sunlight catching the streaks of color on his shirt, and I thought how easily beauty can bloom from what was once ruin. Sometimes, late at night, I still walk through the house and place my hand on the walls. I listen, not for whispers, not for fear, but for stillness. And in that stillness, I hear something gentle, something human, the sound of our lives continuing, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the faint rhythm of Ethan's music upstairs. Ordinary miracles. If you've listened this far, take a moment now. Breathe. Look around. Listen. The world hums in strange ways, but not all frequencies are meant to frighten us. Some are simply the resonance of love surviving. So if this story reached you, let it remind you that even in the deepest quiet, there can be rebirth. Let light back in. Let yourself rebuild. And if it moved you, stay here with us. Like, subscribe, share your thoughts below. Because stories like this aren't just told, they're healed together. And that was how silence finally became music again.